We're excited to begin this webinar series, and I'm excited to be talking to you about something that I am very interested in and do research on. So let's go ahead and get started. I think we all know that we have a big problem with obesity and overweight. In this country, over 2/3 of adults are overweight or obese, and it's a growing problem worldwide. In addition to being a cause of cardiovascular disease and a leading cause of premature mortality in this country, it's also a leading cause of osteoarthritis and cancer at an annual cost of $147 billion. But beyond that, of course, we know that obesity and overweight problems are very difficult emotionally for many people, that many people have struggled with these problems for years. And it's very important that we have effective approaches for everyone to help them lose weight and prevent regaining weight once they've lost it. So the state of the field as far as weight loss interventions goes is that the mainstay is interventions that combine information and education about diet and exercise. And for the most part, they yield pretty good results, clinically significant results, somewhat modest, but they do have an impact on some of the outcomes that we talked about in the last slide. But the results are quite variable, and perhaps more importantly, most people over 2 to 4 years after participating in a program regain the weight, and many people actually regain more weight than they lost in the first place. So why the disappointing results with these interventions, and what's needed to improve on these outcomes? Well, for one thing, I think we all know that stress can be a major factor influencing our eating. This cartoon reads, "This is going to be a 2-cupcake Friday." We've all seen how stress can influence our appetite, our choice of food, and also interfere with our efforts to make healthy decisions, eat the right food, and exercise as we would like to. Another emotional issue affecting weight and attempts to lose weight is what we call emotional eating. The caption of this slide is, "What do you eat for anxiety?" Emotional eating can be defined as a maladaptive response to difficult or negative emotions. It influences our choice of food. About 40% of people will eat more in a state of negative mood, but more importantly, stress and negative emotions influence choice of food, so that if given a choice between normal foods and highly palatable foods, foods that are high calorie, sweet, salty, fatty, by and large, both animals in animal models and people will choose the palatable food. And of course, we call this comfort food, food that we know will relieve the emotional discomfort. And this kind of eating can be triggered by external stressors, which evoke fear, anxiety, or other negative emotions, or by internal states of emotional distress. And this is particularly true in people with anxiety and mood disorders. So the biological basis for eating is pretty well known. Throughout evolution, animal systems have developed systems for managing food intake to maintain energy balance. In higher primates and mammals in general, peripheral signals from the gut and peripheral tissue send information to the brain stem and hypothalamus, which regulate food intake. This is the homeostatic system controlling food intake. But in addition, we humans have evolved higher cortical functions and complex limbic systems involved in regulating mood and the response to mood and stress. So on the right side of this slide now, we see a whole other system that is involved in regulating food intake. This is called the Hedonic System because it involves the pleasurable aspect of eating, foods that make us feel better, that relieve emotional discomfort or are simply pleasurable and rewarding. This involves systems including the amygdala, which is the command center for the limbic system's stress response, the reward areas of the brain that produce dopamine, and the prefrontal cortex that sort of sits on top of the rest of the brain and in normal states regulates our responses, controls our behaviors and actions so that they're in line with our conscious decisions and goals, but can be overridden by the limbic system and the triggers that emotional distress caused in the nervous system, activating the limbic response, the stress response, and also the reward system. The prefrontal cortex can actually be essentially shut off by stress and negative emotion, and this system then can influence the homeostatic system and in turn food intake. The pleasurable aspect of food, especially comfort food, the highly palatable food that we talked about, is rewarding. It leads to release of dopamine in the brain, as we'll see further in slides to come. And this pleasurable aspect has a reinforcing effect such that we learn that to relieve discomfort, these foods will be helpful. And that then becomes a learned association so that when we're in states of emotional distress, we're more likely to engage in the same behavior again, which is eating the comfort food. And eventually these become habits. Let's look now at some of the evidence that stress and negative emotions influence eating. First of all, many adults report that engaging in unhealthy behaviors as a result of stress, including skipping a meal, eating to manage stress, and overeating or eating unhealthy foods, the palatable foods that we talked about. Studies such as this one, which is a cross-sectional study, have shown that the more stress in our lives, the more likely we are to be overweight. This large community sample administered a comprehensive assessment of lifetime exposure to stressors of various kinds. And you can see that a dose-response relationship here, such that the lowest level of stress in the lifetime is associated with the being normal weight, the highest level with being obese, and in between with being overweight. There are also some longitudinal studies with very large sample sizes that have demonstrated this same relationship between exposure to stress of different kinds and weight gain over time. Let's look briefly at the neuroimaging evidence for how the brain's response to stress and negative emotion influences eating. Briefly, this slide, the top part, shows that obese subjects, when exposed to a food cue, especially a favorite food, comfort food, activate the brain's reward system compared to normal weight individuals, which show very little response to the same cue. Similarly, the obese group shows activation of the reward system when exposed to a stressor, and we don't see the same response in normal weight individuals. So there is a biological basis for how we respond to food, and even just the anticipation of rewarding and palatable food will activate the brain's reward system in anticipation of receiving the reward. And this then influences behavior and our choice of food and our ability to act in accordance with our conscious goals, such as when we're trying to lose weight. Emotional eating has also been the subject of a number of studies. It is associated with chronic exposure to high levels of stress. In longitudinal studies, it's a better predictor of weight gain than other types of eating behavior and other lifestyle factors like physical activity and alcohol or substance use. And in weight loss and weight loss maintenance studies, emotional eating is a good predictor, a strong predictor of outcomes, such that the higher the emotional eating, the higher someone rates themselves on an emotional eating scale, the less weight they tend to lose and the more weight they tend to regain over time. An example of a neuroimaging study on emotional eating is this one that shows that comfort food activates the brain reward center as well during the negative mood state. The top part of this slide is a cross-section of the brain, a brain scan, showing the results of the average results of the brain's response to being given a taste of a milkshake while in the scanner compared to a tasteless solution. The milkshake activates the brain's reward center. The lower part of this slide breaks subjects down into those that rate themselves as emotional eaters and those that are considered non-emotional eaters. So the emotional eaters are in red, and the y-axis here is the relative activation of the brain's reward system. Clearly, the response is much stronger in the emotional eaters in the negative mood state, which is induced by actually having subjects recall some sad, difficult experience in their life while listening to sad music. A very reliable way of inducing a negative mood. We see the opposite pattern in a neutral mood when the subjects recall a neutral experience in their lives. So again, there's a biological basis. The brain is wired to respond to food depending on our exposure to stress and also our mood state. Putting this together now, stressors can sometimes be positive. We actually respond to challenges. The stress of preparing for a performance or a big game actually motivates us and engages healthy coping strategies to prepare and to reduce the stress so that we feel prepared. How we respond to stress is partly determined by individual and social factors and partly by the type of the stressor and the severity of it and how chronic it is. What we call bad stress or distress can have a number of untoward consequences. Physically, it results in physiological dysregulation with chronic activation of the stress response and secretion of cortisol with long-term impact on physical health. And psychologically, we respond to distress with negative emotions, with fear, anxiety, anger. And negative emotions, as we've talked about, can influence choices for healthy behavior and actually lead to unhealthy choices, to eating foods that are not good for us, that we know will cause weight gain or result in not losing weight if we're on a diet. And these behaviors can become habitual through the reward system that we talked about, and ultimately chronic exposure to negative emotions and distress can affect our mental health overall. This psychological pathway can also influence physical health, and overall the response to stress can lead to more stress over time as we fail to find healthy coping strategies for dealing with stress. So this is to set up where mindfulness comes in, and now let's talk about mindfulness. The first thing to note is that we go through life on autopilot much of the time. We are often not aware of the decisions that we're making, of the behaviors we're engaging in, because we're doing them automatically. They've become habitual and our minds are elsewhere. We're also very busy. We tend to keep ourselves very busy. We crave busyness to the point that we multitask. And we spend very little time in the present moment. Much of the time, mentally, we're looking ahead to the future or looking back to things that happened in the past. As a consequence, we're missing out on a great deal of the moments in our lives, the opportunities to just notice what's happening in the present moment and what's happening within ourselves, to be comfortable with ourselves, to know ourselves and our reactions, to recognize when we're engaging in automatic behaviors and unhealthy habits. Because we're preoccupied with thoughts and in the thinking mind. A definition of mindfulness is the awareness that emerges from paying attention on purpose and non-judgmentally to things as they are. Let's just take a moment to reflect on this definition. You often hear mindfulness defined as simply paying attention in the present moment. But it's more than that. It is the awareness of paying attention, that we are intentionally paying attention to what's happening, both internally and externally in any given moment, and from moment to moment, that we accept without judgment what is happening, and that we're not actively engaged in the moment in trying to change the way things are. Learning to be more mindful can help us in a number of ways in relation to eating and weight loss, as we'll see. Practices for cultivating greater mindfulness have been around for thousands of years and are part of most all spiritual traditions. They were first brought into the healthcare setting by John Kabat-Zinn here at UMass Medical School in 1979 when he introduced the Stress Reduction Clinic, which later was called the Mindfulness-based Stress Reduction Program, and was described in his first book, Full Catastrophe Living. It was later adapted for depression and for prevention of relapse for substance abuse disorders, and there have been a number of other adaptations developed based on the format of MBSR, Mindfulness-based Stress Reduction, including interventions for eating and weight loss, as we'll see. But first, just to look at the general format of mindfulness-based interventions. They're taught in a classroom format, which provides opportunity both for teaching about topics related to health, the stress response, its effect on the body, and so on, and for discussion and inquiry with participants so that they can share their experiences, learn from each other. The teacher can guide them in learning to explore and investigate their experience and how to use the practices that they're taught. Formal meditation practices are taught in the classes. This is on the upper right, a picture of a class engaging in the body scan. Other practices are sitting meditation, walking meditation, mindful movement, or gentle yoga. Each class involves teaching and participation in a formal meditation practice. And there's homework for each class. And we like to say that 99% of the learning in a mindfulness program is the work we do on our own at home. Most programs have the expectation that there will be daily formal practice of 30 to 45 minutes, sometimes up to an hour, practicing the body scan, mindful sitting meditation, walking meditation, yoga, and also informal practices. Practicing applying mindfulness to our daily lives, the various activities, the things that we encounter from day to day, which really is where this practice becomes so beneficial. We need to learn the meditation and to learn to strengthen our ability to pay attention, to notice what's going on, including our reactions to experience, and we do that with the basic meditation practices. But eventually, what we really are after is to apply mindfulness throughout our day. It's not just a matter of practicing for 30 minutes a day. It's learning to be more mindful, learning to be aware of our experience from moment to moment, and to be less reactive so that we can choose how we want to respond to any given situation, including challenging, stressful situations that might involve difficult emotions. and challenging thoughts. There's been enough research done on mindfulness-based interventions now that we can say with confidence that they are effective for emotional distress. Last year, the most methodologically rigorous meta-analysis was published in the Journal of American Medical Association Internal Medicine and involved a very large sample size. The authors concluded that there was strong evidence that mindfulness is effective for anxiety, depression, and chronic pain. These effect sizes are comparable to what we see with medications for these conditions. Other meta-analyses have shown that mindfulness is effective for stress reactivity and for prevention of relapse, recurrence of depression, and substance abuse. There's also been considerable neuroimaging studies of mindfulness, and we know that mindfulness training actually reduces emotional reactivity in the brain. In this study, comparing participants in a mindfulness-based stress reduction program to a control group, the area in the circle is represented in the bar graph here. The control participants are in blue, the participants that receive mindfulness training in red. You can see in these two areas illustrated that the reaction, the response in the brain is much lower to a negative mood state, induced very much in the same way as the earlier experiment with food that we talked about. In this case, subjects were shown very sad film clips, which they with which they rated themselves in terms of the degree of sad mood. And the sad mood produces reactions in certain areas of the brain that process negative mood, and the response is much smaller in the group that received the mindfulness training. Even the structure of the brain changes with just 8 weeks of mindfulness training in an MBSR class. The upper part of this slide shows reduction in the volume of the amygdala, this little red dot here. And the lower part, the hippocampus in orange on both sides, showing that the volume of the hippocampus increases after just 8 weeks of mindfulness training. So what is the role for mindfulness in health behaviors, including eating and weight management? Health behaviors also include physical activity and taking care of one's health, which won't be the focus of the talk today, but mindfulness may have a role there as well. In fact, the basic mindfulness class is intended to improve our focus on our own health and simply taking care of ourselves. Mindfulness helps us to accept things as they are, including difficult emotions that may be problematic in terms of our eating behavior and our attempts to lose weight and maintain weight loss. By becoming more aware, we can be less reactive and better able to make healthy choices in line with our goals and values. So if you recall, under stressful and states of negative emotion, our goals and values are controlled by that prefrontal cortex that we talked about earlier, which tends to be shut off by those states. And mindfulness can actually bring them back online, so to speak, so that we can be more aware of moment to moment, even when we're facing difficulty, what our goals and values are, and conform our choices to fit them. We become more aware of thoughts and emotions with mindfulness training, habits of mind we've developed in relation to food and how they trigger unhealthy behaviors. And based on the evidence that mindfulness can help prevent relapse of certain conditions, it may also help to prevent relapse to unhealthy behaviors when we've actually made a lifestyle change, when we've changed our diet, our level of physical activity to lose weight, to help maintain weight loss. There have been a number of interventions developed for eating and weight loss. First, what we would call mindfulness-based interventions have the basic components that I talked about a little earlier. They, for the most part, are variations on mindfulness-based stress reduction with in the inclusion of information related to diet and physical activity, basic behavioral and psychoeducational components that you would find in other weight loss interventions. And they often involve specific training in mindful eating practices as well. There have been other applications of mindfulness that we might call incorporating mindfulness skills training into traditional behavioral interventions or acceptance-based interventions. I won't have more to say about these interventions, which are somewhat different. They don't involve subjects being taught formal meditation practices and encouraged to develop a regular daily meditation practice, but rather teaching specific mindfulness skills to apply in certain situations. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, the original program, the 8-week program, actually begins with a focus on eating mindfully. The very first exercise in the program is to take a single raisin and to spend several minutes using all 5 senses to investigate the raisin, to very slowly move towards placing it in the mouth, noticing taste, and eventually chewing and swallowing. To illustrate the contrast between how we normally would eat raisins, we grab a handful of raisins and shove them in our mouth. They're gone in a flash. We're hardly aware of all the sensations involved. This is just one illustration of the autopilot that we talked about earlier, the way we go through life doing many things on autopilot, automatically, without paying conscious attention, without slowing things down to really notice what's happening, both externally and internally. In addition, as I mentioned, the mindfulness-based stress reduction program emphasizes throughout the program the relationship between stress and healthy behaviors, and in general, paying attention to one's own health as part of getting to know oneself better, being more self-aware, taking care of oneself. There have actually been some studies done with mindfulness-based stress reduction for eating and weight loss. This is some preliminary data from my colleagues and I here at UMass Medical School, where we administered a survey to 333 participants, just the regular MBSR classes here at UMass, not people who were seeking to lose weight or had issues with obesity or overweight. The questionnaire included questions about emotional eating, such as when I feel anxious, I find myself eating. When I feel blue, I often overeat. And when I feel lonely, I console myself by eating. The charts on the lower part of the slide, on the left side, show the results of the mindfulness class in terms of scores on the emotional eating scale. Significant reduction in emotional eating after the class. And if we break down participants into those who were overweight or normal weight, the difference from prior to the class to after the class in emotional eating scores is quite striking. This is just preliminary data. We don't have follow-up data to know if over time these individuals actually lose weight. But we are engaged in an NIH-funded study right now that will help us to understand this better, and also the brain changes associated with participating in a mindfulness-based stress reduction program for people who have emotional eating. Adaptations of MBSR and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is the adaptation for depression that I mentioned earlier, include a focus on mindfulness training in each session, as we discussed, often incorporate elements of mindful eating and additional components around diet and exercise and behavioral goal setting and problem solving. Traditional weight loss interventions incorporated into the basic framework of a mindfulness program. There are a number of popular books written about mindful eating. These are some of them. In terms of an an intervention that's been studied with clinical research. Mindfulness-based eating awareness training, developed by Jean Christeller, has the most well studied. Components of the mindful eating program include learning to eat slowly and savoring our food and the entire experience of eating, recognizing signals from the body of hunger and fullness and not confusing physical hunger with emotional hunger, cultivating greater self-acceptance, which is something that many people with weight issues struggle with, and gratitude. And as in all mindfulness programs, greater awareness of thoughts and feelings, and in particular in relation to food and eating, body image, and weight. Participants also learn to practice the mini mindfulness meditation before meals. This is one of the active ingredients of the MB Eat program. Let's look now at the evidence for mindfulness-based programs for eating and weight loss. There have been systematic reviews done first for eating behaviors, and the result is that these reviews found that mindfulness-based interventions are effective for emotional eating and binge eating, that the effect size is largest for binge eating, which is an extreme form of emotional eating, eating large amounts of food in a short period of time, triggered by negative emotions, and that the interventions to date have not been shown to be superior to well-designed cognitive behavioral control conditions, at least in the short term, which is something we'll come back to in a moment. I should say both for the interventions for eating behaviors and for weight loss, which we'll talk about in a moment, we do not yet have large randomized controlled trials that will be very helpful in this field. But the evidence to date is promising for eating behaviors, and for weight loss, mindfulness interventions. Mindfulness-based stress reduction alone has not been shown to be effective. This is in the short term at least. There are a number of problems with these studies, and more needs to be done. But when mindfulness includes the nutrition and energy balance components or behavioral components that are found in traditional weight loss programs, mindfulness programs do appear to be effective for weight loss. Again, at least in the short term, I think the longest follow-up period to date is 4 months. So in summary, mindfulness-based interventions are effective for emotional eating and binge eating. For weight loss, combining mindfulness training with behavioral strategies holds promise, but more needs to be done. Some directions for future research include longer follow-up periods. Mindfulness interventions focus on changing how we think about our relationship to food, our relationship to difficult emotions and stress that impact how we eat and other healthy behaviors. And these changes may take time. An interesting observation about the mindfulness literature is that there have been some examples now of mindfulness-based interventions for other conditions where, when compared to a well-designed control like cognitive behavioral therapy, at relatively short follow-up periods of a few months, the two conditions appear to be equally effective. But with longer follow-up, out to a year or longer, we sometimes see a separation such that the participants in the mindfulness program continue to improve, continue to show improved outcomes, and participants in the cognitive behavioral program lose some of the gains that they had made in terms of outcomes. And this may be because mindfulness-based interventions are really encouraging us to change the way we live. It's a lifestyle change And with time, the effects we believe will be progressive. And we need these kinds of longer follow-up studies in the eating and weight loss field. We need to understand better how these mindfulness interventions stack up to other approaches. Very importantly, we need studies of diverse populations. To date, we don't have much data on this, and this is particularly important because rates of obesity are higher in minority populations than in the general white population. And finally, we need to understand the role of mindfulness in weight loss maintenance, which is a study that my colleagues and I here at UMass are engaged in, but not yet been any published studies to cite in this regard. So I want to thank you for your attention and for paying attention throughout this webinar. We can now move into questions.
Thanks, Carl. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine, and I'm going to be facilitating the question and answer section of this. Carl, we already had one question come in, and it's a big one, probably. So could you speak for a minute or two about teaching these skills or using these skills and these approaches with individuals who have serious mental illness? What work has been done, or what adaptations might need to be done to effectively engage that population in these approaches?
Right. That's a great question. Certainly there has been some work done with mindfulness-based interventions for depression, even bipolar disorder, and in recent years, even people with psychotic symptoms, so severe mental disorders. The evidence for depression, anxiety is quite strong, that mindfulness can be taught effectively to improve symptoms. Bipolar disorder, we don't have as much data yet, but there is evidence that it can improve some aspects of people's lives. And for psychotic disorders, there is promising early research that certain outcomes in people with these symptoms can be improved with mindfulness interventions. So I start with that simply to say that there is, I think, convincing evidence that mindfulness can be taught to people with serious mental disorders. There has not yet been anything published that I'm aware of on using mindfulness-based interventions for weight loss with people with serious mental disorders, except to say that knowing that rates of depression are often very high in people with overweight and obesity. Depression, at least, has not been shown to negatively affect the outcome. These people seem to do as well. And knowing that mindfulness-based interventions are effective for depression, anxiety, and emotional distress would be a good rationale for believing that it could be helpful to people with serious mental disorders as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carl. The questions are coming in quickly. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Just a reminder to send a question. You can use your question kind of portion of your dashboard or raise your hand, and we could try to open it for discussion. So let's see here. There was a question about, is there any research on using, I think the question is, using DBT with mindfulness or any of those combinations?
So there is one study that I'm aware of that was basically a DBT intervention. Of course, mindfulness is one of the skills taught in DBT. So DBT, like ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, these are interventions that are largely adaptations of cognitive behavioral therapy which have incorporated other components, including mindfulness skills training. So there's one study with promising results with DBT where mindfulness was taught as part of the intervention for weight loss. There are a number of studies with ACT-based weight loss interventions, or more generally acceptance-based interventions. These usually include, all of them do to my knowledge, traditional components of weight loss interventions incorporated into the acceptance-based or ACT-based intervention. And some of them do show significant results in terms of both eating behaviors and weight loss.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. Question on, do you have some staff, or does UMass have staff available to conduct outreach programs for like your study or to implement this in the community?
We certainly have staff. Part of what Spark does is, like we're doing with this webinar series, try to get the word out about research and on evidence-based practices for a number of conditions, both mental health and physical health related to people with mental disorders. So we can and do outreach in the community, and we can do more of that. As far as actually implementing or providing service, that's not something that we do, but we can be a resource for linking people to places where they can get help.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, a little back to some of the biology that you were showing. Somebody said they had heard glucose has something to do with one's mind's energy. Do you know anything about glucose and how that plays into some of these reductions? Might be a little sciencey.
Only my own experience that a sugar load causes me a significant decline in cognitive function for me, and I usually wind up needing to take a nap. But as far as the brain regions that we were showing, certainly glucose is one of the components of these palatable comfort foods that activates the brain reward system. So you can get quite a spike in dopamine release in the reward system with a glucose infusion. It's at least oral infusion. I don't know that you would get the same result if it was administered peripherally. So the pleasure of sugar is reflected in activation in the reward system in the brain, certainly.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to keep these together when they're topically related, but it's getting difficult. So we're bouncing around a little bit. So let's go back to, actually, let me take care of a few housekeeping questions. So somebody did ask about CEU credits. Unfortunately, we do not have CEU credits available for today's webinar. This is our inaugural webinar for the Spark webinar series, so we're still working out some kinks. Our next webinar will be on October 14th, and that will be with Dr. Doug Zedonis, who will be talking about co-occurring disorders and the mental health needs of, I think, well, there's a few different ones coming out. But anyways, October 14th, mark your calendars, and we will do our best to have CEU credits available for that. So we apologize for any inconvenience for today. And yes, this presentation will be available online, so you can check back. So again, the website is was showed earlier. It's www.umassmed.edu/spark, S-P-A-R-C. So we will have it there, and we'll also disseminate it through our email blast, which is probably how most of you found this webinar. Facebook, Twitter, all that fun stuff. So let me get those out of the way. Back to you, Carl. The comment is, obesity rates are also higher in those who have a higher index of traumatic experiences.
Yes.
Know anything about the effectiveness of MBI-related weight loss strategies with specifically individuals with post-traumatic stress?
Right, right. So I sort of alluded to that in talking about stressors and how they influence health behaviors, and was thinking of trauma as part of that. So certainly in the population with binge eating disorder, the rates of trauma are very high, and MB-EAT, mindfulness-based eating awareness training, was originally developed for binge eating disorder, and as I mentioned, has been shown to be quite effective both for reducing binge eating and weight. So in a population with high rates of trauma, that at least the MB-EAT intervention has been shown to be effective. And I think part of its effectiveness has to do with focusing on the thoughts and emotions that are triggered around food and everything that involves that may relate to people's traumatic experiences and memories.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch a gear again. There's a couple of people who I think are now talking from their own personal experience. So one person is kind of asking about, you know, how long does it really take to change a habit and change this emotional eating habit? You know, the person finds themselves often falling off the wagon, if you will, after about a week. And secondary to that is somebody else is saying, you know, as a potential emotional eater, what would you recommend as next steps to begin a mindfulness-based eating practice, which might be good for anybody. I mean, we have a national audience today, so how could they go about finding such a program in their area?
Right. Well, as far as the first part of that question goes, I think it's important to keep in mind that these mindfulness-based approaches, for the most part, are not. It's not a diet. It's not like a diet where you're trying to lose a certain amount of weight in every week or every month. We're really talking about adapting, changing the way we live our lives, and that can take time. Changing habits which are deeply ingrained and learning new ones. So I would say to not focus on a time frame. If you're thinking about engaging in this sort of thing, it can be challenging to develop a regular meditation practice. It can take time. There's often sort of a start and stop phenomenon that we see. But the more people do it, the more benefits they see in many areas of their lives. So over time, it often gets easier to incorporate the practice into your daily routine. And that's where I think over time you'll begin to see habits changing. We also have to be careful not to try too hard. And mindfulness is very much about not striving, but being kind and compassionate toward ourselves and allowing things to take however long they need. As far as learning more about how to engage in these practices, one great resource is the Center for Mindful Eating, which has a website, centerformindfuleating.org. It's housed at the University of Indiana or Indiana University, where Jean Christeller developed MB Eat. And it has a lot of great resources there about that particular intervention, and also part of the website is you can look for specialists, from therapists to dietitians to physicians, who have particular expertise in mindful eating in your area based on the directory that they have there. So www.centerformindfuleating.org.
Great, thank you, Carl. I just sent that out to everybody via the chat feature, so hopefully you can see that.
Oh, great.
So there was a question here, which might be out of your realm of expertise, but you continue to surprise me with how much you know about this stuff, is a question regarding the stress hormones that are released during intense exercise and what kind of reactions in the brain they cause, and as they relate to emotional challenges, and how that might play into weight gain loss. I mean, I understand what you're saying is that the mindfulness eating is not about weight gain and loss, but you know, could you speak at least to relation to exercise in mindfulness-based practices?
Well, the biology of that question I can't answer, I'm afraid. I don't know. It's a great question. I'd be very curious to know more about that. Thank you for that question. As far as exercise goes, there's been very little done so far. A little bit, though, on using mindfulness to help us to engage in more physical activity. So often people with overweight and obesity have become very sedentary and very inactive, and they experience any attempt to increase levels of physical activity or exercise as very unpleasant, and that can be as simple as being embarrassed in going to a gym, or just the physical discomfort of getting active and exercising. Mindfulness can, for the reasons that we talked about earlier, and has been used in a couple of studies that I'm aware of, but we don't have real outcome data yet. But there are some efforts underway to incorporate use of mindfulness practice in exercise so that we can be more aware of how we're reacting to uncomfortable physical sensations, to discomfort, to pain, to fatigue, not necessarily to torture ourselves and to suffer, but to be, again, kind and compassionate, to do as much as you can and not sort of automatically react by giving up and, you know, stopping.
Thanks, Carl. Well, I definitely think this has been very helpful. There's a couple other questions which I think are a little outside the realm of our scope. But we actually have a question here in the room, so I'm going to give it over to Marianne Davis who has a question. Carl.
Hi, Carl. You won't be surprised by this question, I'm sure, knowing but I'm wondering what the research says around how young a person can be and benefit from mindfulness-based practices?
So there is growing evidence that it can have some remarkable effects on kids as early as elementary school age. I know there are lots of mindfulness programs for even younger kids with anecdotal evidence that these kids take to it very well, and that parents and teachers see changes, positive changes. As far as the research literature goes, there are studies now that have been published in the elementary school age showing improvements in behavior, well-being, attention in class, and in the teenage years, even more studies. So there's a lot of interest in doing more research in younger people and understanding how it works and how to adapt it.
Thank you, Carl. I see one more question, I think, quick one, hopefully. I mean, I think you touched on eating disorders a little bit, but the question was, how effective is mindfulness for disordered eating patterns and thinking? And that was a question from the audience, and I could see, you know, maybe perhaps they're thinking about people with anorexia per se, or things like that. Do you have any thoughts?
Right. So as far as anorexia goes, I'm not aware of any studies on that condition, which is very tough to treat, as we know. For binge eating disorder and bulimia, for binge eating disorder, there certainly is good evidence that mindful eating programs are effective at reducing binge eating and weight. Again, at the extreme with bulimia, I'm not aware of a study that specifically included people with bulimia. But I'm sure someone's doing that, and we'll know at some point, given the evidence for binge eating disorder.
Definitely. Well, I mean, thank you so much, Carl. I think, I mean, we got a few thank yous from the audience, and like you said, I think there is still a lot to learn. This is a very hot topic area that is likely to continue to grow, so we appreciate you sharing your knowledge to date on this, and we also look forward to hearing about more progress on the work that you're doing and that the Mindfulness Center here is doing. I think with that, we'll take it to a close. Thank you, everybody who's still online. Again, on October 14th, we will be having our second Spark webinar, and we also, like my colleague had mentioned earlier, we have a website, www.umassmed.edu/spark. You can join our mailing list there. We are also on Facebook, Twitter. So we have a lot of exciting work going on in the center related to a broad range of psychosocial and systems research. So we hope you'll stay in touch and join us in the future. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Carl.